I'm Stefan Dercon. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies. I'm here with Paul Collier, who is the founder of the center, the founding director, and that's 40 years ago. So we're going to take some time talking a little bit about, the beginning. So Paul, why the center? I know it started in 1986 as the unit and a few years later as the center, but why?
I and two other people have been working on a comparative project of Tanzania and Kenya, which was trying to compare the coffee boom. And this was because my original work had been on Tanzania in the late 70s, at a time of what was called the coffee boom, which was caused by a frost in Brazil. And nobody knew whether the frost had just damaged the crop in Brazil or destroyed it. So because coffee supply from Brazil was enormous at the time and collapsed, the world coffee price shot up. And both Tanzania and Kenya were growing coffee. And so they both had this coffee boom. And they adopted very different policies on it. I'd just done a rural survey in Tanzania, which produced a little book, Labour and Poverty in Rural Tanzania. And that had given me an opportunity to really look at the rural economy of Tanzania. And from there emerged the idea of what's happening now that there's this coffee boom. And we were immensely lucky to get the World Bank interested. And so the World Bank sent me on a thing called a basic economic report. And I was supposed to be the advisor looking at the rural economy. And as I was doing that, the coffee boom was just starting. And I could see this sort of prosperity spreading. And the policies were so different in Tanzania, where I was working, and next door in Kenya. And fortuitously, the president of the World Bank at the time, McNamara, was so interested, we managed to get support for a comparative study. And that was a lot of work. It was a huge study. And it produced a book of microeconomics, which was called Peasants and Governments, and a sister book on the macro aspect of the economy, this boom, called Controlled Urban Economies. And that pair had quite a big impact worldwide. It was about the last time when books were the major vehicle for research, but the advantage of books over articles, there are many disadvantages, but the big advantage is you can do a big sustained argument. And with one volume on macro and one volume on micro, at the time, all economists were either specializing in micro or specializing in macro. And so I was sort of pretty unusual in spanning the macro and micro. But with all that work, it made it possible and credible to move from this little unit, which was a little team of people who'd been working together. 3 years later, Margaret Thatcher insisted on setting up a competition of Oxford getting any pay rise. Was that we held a competition for a thing called a designated research centre. And there were going to be 2 for the whole subject of economics. And we put in a bid. There were 157 bids. It shrank from 157. We got on a long list of 11 competitors. And then we heard that we were the only one of the 11 that didn't have an insider on the committee supporting it. So all the other 10 had somebody on the committee saying, this one's just perfect. Fortunately, they couldn't agree on which one was perfect. And so I think what happened was the one thing they could agree on was the one that nobody was supporting. And so miraculously, we were chosen as one of these 157. And that produced big funding.
So this was must have been around 1991 or 1990 or so that this process was happening.
Yes, the competition was, I think, 89, 90.
Yeah. And this was the Economic and Social Research Council, so the funding body across the UK. Now these days it's all quite usual that there are competitions, but then it was quite remarkable. It is still remarkable that at a time then when development economics was definitely not viewed as something as serious as the rest of economics, that actually a group working on Africa would get it. What was the climate like in terms of within the economics profession for the kind of work you and a few others were doing?
Oh, completely. We were the lowest class. But I was lucky. I'd had 3 very good economics tutors. Keith Griffin, as an undergraduate at Magdalen, who became very famous. And then as a graduate student, Ian Little, again, world-class academic, and Max Cornham, and a third world-class academic. One thing these 3 all taught, I know the truth, and they all radically disagreed with each other.
I mean, to put him a little bit, Keith Griffin was arguably quite a Marxist economist,
Yes.
and Max Gordon became very much standard macro Dutch disease, all this kind of work from very, very opposite sides of it all. Yeah.
Completely. And Ian Little was much more a creative, original thinker.
Yes. Are still famous of the little Merlis type of work and so on.
That's right. So it was a brilliant education to have these 3 big thinkers, serious heavyweights in their own way, all of whom disagreed. And that made me suspicious, I suppose, even at the beginning of orthodoxies. I was clearly a mainstream economist. I mean, the subtitle of Control I'd been economist was the neoclassical approach to structuralism. And that was to say we were taking some of the assumptions of structuralism, which we thought the assumptions were right, but the methodology that the structurists were using, which was a sort of quasi-Marxist methodology, was wrong. And so we spliced the more realistic assumptions of structuralism with the more rigorous method of neoclassical economics. And that was a very good education, I thought. I mean, I was just damn lucky to have that combination.
In terms of, when the centre was set up, of course, this was a small group of other people in Oxford, John Knight, David Bevan, Jan Willem Gunning, Arne Bixton was one of the founders as well. Yeah. I did notice that your first employee was someone called Tim Besley as a summer student. So you have a kind of a collection of, both people based here and then also elsewhere. As a centre, was there something? What was the common factor, you think, between all these different people? What was it actually that drove people? Was there a shared research agenda? Was there a shared way of thinking? How should we think about it at the time?
I think we were empirical.
Okay.
I think we were empiricists and we were pragmatists, I think. So we were prepared to be a bit eclectic on method, but we knew that we needed data, we needed household surveys, but you couldn't just retreat into micro, because some of the phenomena was so clearly macro policy. So that was one feature. And I think another feature was that I got more and more closer to policy issues. And again, I had a wonderful education in that. A lot of my work with the World Bank, which had been going on and off for years, was trying to influence public policy. And so I got drawn quite early on into meeting not sometimes heads of government, but certainly the economists who were advising government. And I became increasingly sympathetic to their struggle. I'll give you an example in Tanzania, where I got to know Benno and Dulu very well. when he was just a really junior academic, who'd just come back from the States. So he got his doctorate from Northwestern, as I remember. He was paired with me as, here's your sort of counterpart. And gradually Benno rose and rose because he was so outstanding. And not only did he become enormously important, but he's introduced me to other people who were influential. I remember him introducing me to Emanuele Tomasini Mutabili, who was the enormously courageous guy who'd tried to stop President Museveni doing mad things, and eventually succeeding. But it took Emanuele 6 years before President Museveni learned how to listen to him.
I think he was at the time permanent secretary of the finance ministry, is that right? And then he later on became then celebrated governor of the central bank in Uganda.
That's right. So eventually I came to learn that the central banks were, in many ways, the key institution because they had the high caliber of people. I can't remember whether you or I founded the Round Table for African Central Bank Governors. I think I.
You did it, absolutely.
But you took it over and did a brilliant job with it, doing a brilliant job with it. But that was enormously important because that forum was a chance for these guys to be free of their finance ministers and talk to each other about the truth and start to forge into a common, because it's a very lonely life being the governor of a central bank where everybody wants you to spend money. The ministers hate you. The president wants to print money. And to turn them into a team that saw they got a common struggle to protect Africa from economic suicide, that was just watching their heroism as they shared their struggles. That was really inspiring. Somebody like me, and perhaps even you, I've never had to be braver than facing a small mouse. But these guys, I've come to realize it, countries need courageous people actually prepared to die. And in a lot of countries, the struggles end up with people who have to die in order to get change. And I've come to have enormous respect for that process of struggle. Struggle that isn't the destructive stuff of, I learned to become very suspicious of these sort of conflict movements where they become businesses. That's how I got myself on the hit list for the FARC in Latin America, because I gradually spread my wings and worked on Latin America as well as on Africa.
So to go back a little bit at this this period of the 1990s, then when it was a center, you very correctly suggest, the one hallmark of the center was the links it built up on macroeconomics across the continent. You, David, Jan Willem, Chris Adam, all these people got quite involved. Also, of course, with Benno, who then moved to the African Economic Research Consortium, a lot of training of central bank analytical people, analysts in these banks, all coming through ultimately with links with us. So that was on the kind of macro side. Research-wise, also, the center started being pioneer in enterprise service, I remember at the time. Work on firms, also longitudinal data sets on households. It wasn't happening in Africa. That was happening here. And then your own strand of work on conflict. So it's a bit like the kind of themes that I think in the 1990s that collectively, but you leading, were pioneering. Why don't you tell us a bit more about how that all came about and so on?
Yeah, I think it became most apparent when I moved as director of the research department at the World Bank.
Which was around when, 98 or something, 97 or something?
97, 8.
Yeah.
But by then I'd sort of learnt an awful lot from CSAE.
Yeah.
And so I remember, because we were doing household surveys, that was something that was common in the World Bank. They were funding household surveys. And I got 8 division chiefs, and one of them was in charge of all these household surveys, including a big module on health. And I said, well, what are you doing on health? Clearly in Africa, health's a terrible problem. I'd been around a load of hospitals in small town Tanzania, small town Uganda, just stomach turning. And so this division chief on health, really good guy, he said, we're studying the demand for health. I said, why are you studying the demand for health? What about the supply of health? I said, we can't study the supply of health because there's no research on it. So I stopped him in his tracks and said, do you mean the reason you're studying the demand for health is that you've already got data on it? He said, yes, that's right, it's researchable, that. We can study, if you put the prices up, because the bank was very keen on cost recovery at the time, if you put the price up, how much does demand drop? You're telling me that there's no research on the supply of healthcare. And we go, well, back. That's what we're going to put our money into. That was a sea change where they actually had to, I forced them to do it. I also forced them to work on Africa. They had no researchers on Africa when I was there to start. None. 140 people in the department. Researchers on Africa, 0.
Yes, right. But it's an interesting thing. You mentioned that. I do remember that time as well. So it became this whole program on service delivery across Africa. I think one of researcher that had been trained with us, Rit Varenica, you took out the bank, and she would co-lead or something that
I
program.
Brought her in and said, you're
leading that and the kind of thing. So we had to kind of quite a bit of influence on that as well. There was also quite a lot on firms going on at the time. That was probably also still quite new in the early 90s to do it. Yeah,
completely. Firms were just supposed to happen as if you got incentives right, then the market economy would bubble up. Yeah. As if there was no issue in the emergence and growth of firms. By then we were starting to know quite a lot of it, partly from Joe Stiglitz's work on the limits of finance and risk-bearing finance, and the difficulty. In his case, it was the difficulties of borrowing for consumption. But you could very equally think about risk-bearing in establishing and building a firm, a small firm. Yeah. These were SMEs, and so that was a line of work which, again, we really pushed, and it flourished. What were the conditions under which you could actually encourage the growth of small firms? Because with small firms, you then got the accumulation of skills, and that whole nexus of the sort of habitat in which small firms thrive. And I remember eventually getting called to, President Kagame got very keen on this years later, and invited me to, because I explained it to his team by saying, think of it as a habitat for small firms. And I said, this word habitat might seem a bit confusing, but suppose the answer to growth was we need a lot of rabbits. If that was what we needed to have a lot of growth, then what would be the habitat that would encourage rabbits? Well, you'd grow a lot of lettuce, for example. Yeah? And he so loved that analogy that he flew me specially to address 200 top public policy people. He gathered them together in an army camp for 3 days once a year. And I was the only foreigner who's ever been at one of these things, I think. And I was to pitch to 200 people the importance of a habitat for small firms and what that meant.
So another strand that clearly, there's 2 more actually. You mentioned earlier a lot of the work on controlled open economies. of course, commodity booms and slumps kept on happening across the continent. So there were quite a lot of people. I remember lots of doctoral students and so on working in all kinds of countries. So how do you think that work, starting with controlled open economies, how did that change the discourse? And so, what do you think are the main things now, looking back at it, that changed the way we think about these things?
Oh, surely, because this was the difference between what Kenya was doing and what Tanzania was doing. And for that matter, what Uganda was doing. I think they were all doing different things. It was the question of whether you should, the government as the wise custodian, taxing the boom itself and then spending it, or whether it was better to leave the boom with the coffee farmers themselves, but share the information with them about the likely duration of the boom. We came to the view that the best thing you could do was share the information with farmers, that farmers were not fools. Farmers knew all about prudence and about risk-bearing. They just didn't have the information. They were actually better at prudence and long-term thinking than were governments.
Right.
It was governments that behaved really foolishly with commodity booms, taxing them and then spending as if there was no tomorrow, which is in the end what happened in Kenya.
Right.
And so this began as a sort of philosophy which I've since become more sort of passionate about, was that by devolving decision-taking down the system to ordinary people, by sharing information with them, they've got all the wisdom. They're more prudent than governments. The big policy errors are much more likely to happen in governments, which have a very short horizon. And so that gradually informed my thinking.
I mean, it also, all that work led to quite a lot of attention, definitely after I think you returned from the World Bank in the early 2000s, to work also on natural resources and how governments should be governing this, isn't it?
Completely.
And there was definitely a lot of people at the center always working on this.
Completely. So we developed a whole line on managing natural resources.
Yeah.
Because in principle, natural resources should be the rocket booster. But so often it isn't.
Yeah.
So often it's actually an opportunity for governments to capture this and then not do anything for their population because they don't tax. I became a convert to the importance of taxation as what was called the sinews of development. It was work I'd eventually developed with Tim Besley, the sinews of the state. And we decided one sinew was tax, because if you didn't tax, you weren't a state. You were just dependent upon aid or something like that with somebody else's agenda. And once you started to tax, because you were reaching into people's pockets, they didn't like it. And then you had to justify. And that need to justify why you were taking money from people's pockets was a very healthy aspect of taxation. And so that was a line of work which I become, again, sort of more passionate about. Running this course on natural resource management was then trying to show people how the struggle between a resource which had the potential to be transformative, but so often became the opposite, that getting that right was really difficult.
Yeah. So this is a course with the Natural Resource Governance Institute that has been running for quite some time these days in the Blavatnik School of Government, and very successfully, and you still
I finally handed it over.
Well, just about, yes, indeed. But it's definitely fascinating. But and maybe on another strand that definitely was developed in the 1990s, and arguably maybe academically, globally, you're most identified with is the beginning of the study of conflict as an economist.
Yeah.
Probably some of your most cited papers.
Yes.
Definitely the most cited paper in Oxford Economic Papers ever is your paper with Anke on conflict.
Right.
So how did that come about, and why that, and then, where do you think it's all gone now?
I remember I was working with Anke on a line of work, but not conflict. We started to look at the effects of conflict, the consequences of conflict. And one of the early results was to show that most of the consequences of conflict, most of the costs, happen after it's over, because it creates a level of uncertainty which persists for years and years and years. If we think about the present terrible stuff in Iran, that's opened a layer of uncertainty that will last for a long time, probably my lifetime. But I remember saying to Anke, let's switch the dependent variable. Let's try and see whether you can find anything that's sort of correlated with the causes of conflict. And I remember saying to me later, she said, I thought at the time you've gone completely cuckoo. But it did open what became a very fertile line of inquiry. And one of the sort of pioneering ideas, which in the end proved a fertile fallacy, if you like, was that whatever else these organizations are, they're not like protest movements. Protest movements, people going in the street, you can do that easily on social media and that sort of thing. It doesn't cost much. An armed conflict, armed struggle, as the left like to call it, cost a huge amount of money. And so the real key to understanding these armed conflicts, armed struggles, was not the heroics. It was the finance. Where were they getting the money to pay for it? Whatever else these organizations were, they were fundamentally businesses. And they came to, some of them lasted for 20 or 30 years. And by the time they'd lasted a long time, the core realistic purpose of the organization was to fund itself. And I had some extraordinary opportunities. This was a global phenomenon. It wasn't just Africa at all. And I remember being in Burma, getting a message somehow got to me from somebody saying, I was a rebel leader in the bush, and somehow I came across your work. I know why I came across the work, because it got translated into Burmese by some organization. And he said, I was the leader of one of these rebel organizations, and I'd like to come and talk to you, but of course I can't come out in the open. Can we meet secretly? And, thinking about it in retrospect, this is not necessarily a good idea. This is a recipe of getting kidnapped.
Yes.
But I took the risk, and it was fascinating. He said, I came to realize that what our organization was actually doing was exchanging. We were cutting down the rainforest. We were hauling the teak across to the border where it could be smuggled out. And there was basically an exchange rate of so many acres of teak smuggled across the border would give us so many Kalashnikovs. And that's what we were doing. We were cutting down the rainforest, getting Kalashnikovs and then killing people with the Kalashnikovs. And I started to think this was not the cause that I'd thought I was fighting for when I joined as a much junior person, gradually risen to be the head of the organization. And so he said, I persuaded my organization that we should seek a peace settlement. And I'm just in the process of trying to do that now. But I wanted to share with you this story. And then I got a similar story in Colombia. I got banned by the FARC. I got on a hit list with the FARC. So for a while, I go to Colombia a lot. I'm going there this summer, but now I think I'm no longer on the hit list.
Right.
But it was quite clear that when the FARC sat down with the government, and the government said, "What do you want?" The FARC didn't know.
Didn't know anymore. Yes. Yeah.
So these were insights that were
Yes.
not fully right. These things are never fully right.
Yes.
But it was a salutary wake-up call.
Would have been useful to put this in the hand of Riek Machar and Salva Kiir in South Sudan and other places like that, indeed.
Yeah.
So look, to look back a little bit, so we talk a lot about research that could be done, different strands that emerged in that period and so on. Why a center? Why trying to keep a center going? We've now gone for 40 years. So why a center? Why is that so useful as a structure?
Well, first of all, the center brings together young people doing doctorates with early career researchers doing postdocs. I seem to remember I hired you.
It may well be, yes. That's one of the early ones, yes.
And with senior people.
Yeah.
And that continuity is itself enormously important. There's a lot of people who were trained in the center and then Catherine Tillow, fantastic. Now, very senior in the IMF. But she started in the center.
Yeah.
And so these alone would justify a center. But then you establish data sets, you establish a sort of track record of philosophy, a reputation, and so you're able to raise money. And that is enormously, and that's very important, having that continuity, because the big research funds want to support an institution that has a credible record. And that's what we built. And it was choppy waters sometimes, but that's what we built and sustained.
So
40 years on.
Yeah, 40 years, it's still there and it's still going. One of the early things, you described already, on the policy front, there's always been various people, not necessarily everybody, some were more research-oriented, but others were more interested on the policy side, reaching out to the policymakers on the continent. How do you think about, other forms of legacies on the continent? One of the early things that even when the ESRC funding came as a center, there was a requirement to do some conference, or at least as part of the proposal. So it's actually the conference started probably about 35 years ago.
Yes.
Not necessarily yearly at the time, but we've definitely been
the Journal of African
and indeed
Economists.
in a journal. So what do you think, if you think of some of these legacy decisions, so what are they, and how do you think it actually manifests itself these days, even on the continent in Africa?
Yeah, I think first of all, the spirit is to try things and see what happens. You can always close things down if they don't work, but if you don't start things, and having an institution is more robust environment for starting things. Start a journal. So many African attempts to start journals peter out. Because they're not anchored into a robust institution that is academically independent. And so the Journal of African Economists, established journal, good circulation, all the rest of it, established that principle early on. Then we did book series. We've had a whole slew of specialist books on countries, which again is something we could easily spin out, given an institutional structure. What else have we done? We've done a huge amount of work on training through the African Economic Research Consortium. Massive investment. I went for at least 30 years, twice a year, to Kenya, each time for a few days. And that's, that cumulatively is both a big investment of your time, but also you train up people who then they rise. Boy, they rise. I mean, that's the other great thing about elderly academics, which you will increasingly experience. They rise, right? And I've left it too late because mine are now retiring. But that phase that you're now entering into, where you've got a network of people who are rising around you, and including our students at the Blavatnik School, fantastic, fantastic. Most days I get emails from past students at the Blavatnik School, past students at Harvard, past students at Sciences Po in Paris. My menu of past students is formidable, but it's brilliant. It surely is.
And definitely, I would say also for the center, the fact that we have these conferences, which has become, we know in quite a lot of African universities,
massive.
It's one of the important things if they can get selected to come, because it's competitive for them to be able to come. It's an important, almost rite of passage of becoming more senior in these universities.
I think I give the credit to you there. I think you were the one that built the conference up from something that I got started, but I never turned it to more than pedestrian.
Yeah.
But you really did invest heavily in it and make it really good, as you say, both big and prestigious.
Yeah, well, maybe. But that actually leads me to another thing, is that, one of the things, if I think back at the center, even from the early days of the unit, we've been enormously lucky on the base in terms of the support staff that we managed to recruit. There is this kind of incredible legacy all the way going back to the beginning to getting these really strong people who built this up. They stay a long time, clearly find it very exciting.
Absolutely.
So where did you find them?
Not everybody's suited. Because we don't pay fabulously well, the people who stick around are sticking around because they become passionate about the purpose. And that, I think, is the secret. I got a PA now she's stuck around way after normal retirement age. And one of the reasons she said it's actually exciting. There I am at the frontiers of stuff that really, really matters to a lot of people. And that is a purpose that it's a privilege to be part of that. You've got Rose, who's been there for a long time, passionate about it. Could Rose work elsewhere? Of course she could. Does she want to? No, she wants to do this because she believes in it.
Yeah. No, and then we can go back. We had Liz Welsh for a long period when you were there. Sarah Smith you had there in the early days.
Yes, completely.
These were all people that stuck around a long time. But it's quite interesting to because that's probably where what I would reflect on is that, even though, there is no obvious, endless workshops on what the mission statement was or what the values or the judgment was. That's not you, that's not me, but it's quite an interesting thing that there is a common denominator over the years, and that indeed people want to be associated with it, want to come back. You did, think of, currently the editor of the Journal of African Economies is John Hoddenett now, who was a postdoc here many, many years ago, has built up a whole career in the United States and Canada, and he's now happily being the editor here.
It's a matter of walking the talk.
Right.
And at my best, I try to walk the talk. Mm-hmm. You certainly walk the talk and fly the talk. But you can't establish trust through a Zoom. You've got to be face to face. And that means a lot of traveling still. And I went through a phase where I was not in one place for more than 10 days for about 30 years. And that was tough.
Yes.
I'd got a young family and that sort of thing. And you're living the same. And it's tough. It's grueling. But in the end, it's a massive investment that bears fruit.
I know what made sense, 30, 40 years ago when the center started. I was a young student at the time, and it was an exciting time because very few people were doing this kind of work. In academia, it was a bit frowned upon. This was not serious enough. This was too empirical. This was too empiricist even. And, we all got the letters at the time from journals, or this is not for a general interest journal because this is on Africa, the things. That has changed.
That really has, yeah.
But what would you now say to, to younger scholars, to graduate students, to young postdocs and so on? Where do you think careers like this should take them? What should they look for? What would you tell them now?
When I did my doctorate at Nuffield, I was told, you can either do a doctorate in Africa, which is what I wanted to do, or you can be an economist, but not both. And so I did a doctorate in economic theory. And as soon as I finished it, I went back to working in Africa. And I also swore to myself that I would break that. And I did break it. We've now got fellows of economics around the colleges, plenty, who work on Africa. No shortage of that. Same, more recently, with political economy. And you now, you sort of co-chair the political economy seminar, which is fantastic, right? So modern political economy, it can be quantitative, it's analytic, it's hard, but there it is. And so that is a tremendous achievement to breach these barriers where you don't do that. What would I say to a young person now? I'd say, where are the frontiers now in economics? The frontiers are at the borders of the subject, because the borders of each discipline, the disciplines were formed about 150 years ago, really. We've got the sciences and all the various social sciences. Anthropology was over there, economics was over here. Social psychology was over there, economics over here. The really fertile areas now are the interweaving of evolutionary biology with economics, and with anthropology with economics. There's enormously fertile work, quantitative work on economic anthropology, which I think is a wonderful cross-fertilization. And so that's how I see this happening, that it'll in many ways, that's why I'm excited about the Blavatnik School, which is much more sort of the borderlines in between the territories are more blurred. And so I think that's what's the exciting agenda, is these borderlines will blur.
Okay, so that's on the kind of, on the research. And on the where Africa is going, where when you now look, when you started, it was all about often very basic stabilization, not making big mistakes in the policy environment and managing challenges. Of course, many of these governments have internally even some much better advisors now if they want to use it. So where do you think there the frontier lies? Where do you see this going? What do you tell to a young person that wants to work inside a government there now and wants to be a sensible economist?
First of all, Africa's still falls a long way behind. If you look at the projections, the future of poverty is Africa. So there's an immense challenge to change that. Now, that will be fought in Africa by Africans, undoubtedly. Yeah. And that's the exciting thing, is the students who emerge from CSAE either presenting their work through the AERC, presenting their work, learning, and then fighting that fight.
And so what's the role of the centre in that, you think?
We train people. We're providing these forums. You've described it yourself. We've got the places where professionals share, African Governors Round Table, all that sort of thing. We've got places where people get training in skills like how do you, in particular questions like how do you manage natural resources better. And so there's such a wealth of way in which we can provide that these opportunities for young Africans to come, test, grow, get into this business of actually doing the struggle within the country. There's a limit to what expats can do. There's even a limit to what the diaspora can do. You need to be there.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be there.
So finally, in 20 years, centre, I'm sure, will still exist. What do you think success will look like?
At that stage, in 20 years, there'll be, I would say, maybe 7 or 8 really manifestly prosperous African economies growing fast. There'll be the catching up phase still, but they'll be proud of what they've achieved, and they'll still be supporting the centre because CSAE will knit them all together still in various ways. And that will continue to be so the centre will still be there as a networking opportunity and as neutral ground. One of the things I've learnt is that providing a neutral ground is enormously valuable. All these big institutions are too big. They've got too much money, IMF, World Bank, all this sort of thing, UN, all the same. And CSAE provides that neutral ground. We're not scary, but we do have integrity and we have a track record to prove it.
Excellent, Paul. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Stefan.